Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the 7Artisans AF 24mm F1.8. In 2024, 7Artisans not only embraced autofocus with some earlier, less complex lenses, but also a series of slightly more upscale full-frame lenses that are physically larger, they have more features, but they also have a higher but still really inexpensive price tag. First, we got a 50mm f1.8, then an 85mm f1.8, both at an excellent price of $299 US. But the market was really pretty saturated already with both 50 and 85mm f1.8 lenses on Sony E-mount, where I've done all of these reviews, which made these lenses, I think, probably somewhat of a challenge to stand out. So perhaps that's why 7Artisans elected to, at least for now, skip the 35mm focal length and instead bring out a less common 24mm f1.8. So the 7Artisans AF 24mm f1.8 STM is another nicely executed lens with a reasonable price that undercuts the only real competitors at this. Those are the Samyang AF 24mm f1.8 and the Viltrox AF 24mm f1.8. In many ways, this lens is probably too similar to the Viltrox for it to be a true competitor, because this does basically everything the Viltrox does at a cheaper price, leaving the Samyang as the real kind of direct competition, which I'll examine a little bit as a part of today's review. So is this a lens that you should consider adding to your full frame kit? Well, that's what we're going to dive in and take a look at today. First, however, this lens was sent to me for examination from a retailer, but neither the retailer nor the manufacturer has had any input on this review. They will not see it before you do as the public. So this is a fully independent review and my findings are mine alone. Let's start by taking a look at the build and handling. All of these lenses have initially come to E-mount, as is the case here with the 24mm. However, in the passage of time, we have seen for both the 50 and 85mm that Z-mount and L-mount versions have come out. And that latter is, I think, even more interesting to me, and interesting to see whether or not 7Artisans will actually be a part of the L-mount consortium if they aren't already, which would be really interesting because then the lenses could essentially be like first-party lenses there, get better support in terms of profiles and things like that. Now, as mentioned, the $299 price tag is cheaper than the competitors, about $100 less. And so certainly on the value side of things, there is positive there. This lens, as has been the case for this series, they aren't particularly small lenses. Now, not to say that they're huge, but the 50mm f1.8 was actually quite a large lens. The 85mm was surprisingly a little smaller than the 50mm, and this is very slightly smaller than what even the 85mm is. And so it is a 72mm diameter, which is 2.83 inches, 92 millimeters in length, or 3.6 inches. All three have had a 62mm front filter thread, which is great, so you can share filters across them. Now, what's surprising with the weight is that while it's a little bit smaller than the 85mm lens, at least in terms of length, it's actually just very slightly heavier than that lens, which I can't quite explain. What I can say, however, is we do have a very nice build quality here. It's a great looking lens. It's a nice black anodized finish, a very clean design. I even like how that on the back and what could look a little bit blank, they've added the 7Artisans logo there, which I think just kind of gives it a little bit more of a cohesive look. And so we have a decent amount of features. We've got an aperture ring, AF/MF switch, we've got a custom or function button here, and then of course the manual focus ring. So all of that is, you know, very worthwhile. The earliest, the 50mm f1.8, which was the first in the series, it had kind of a mushy AF/MF switch. They've really cleaned that up. However, the switch feels much more definite and precise. The feel of the function button feels good, no problem there. The aperture ring it's a declicked, there's no click option, although it does show the 1/3 stop to tenths. Now, they've cleaned up one of the oddities on that, and one of them still remain. So they have f1.8 and then f2 as marked positions, but they showed two 1/3 stop to tenths in between f1.8 and f2, which of course is nonsensical, as there is no stops or third stops between f1.8 and f2. So that's a little ridiculous. However, they have cleaned up that it used to be that at f16, which is minimum aperture, they also had markings for 2 1/3 aperture stops after that before you got to the automatic option. So again, that was confusing in that f16 is the smallest aperture there, and so there is nothing beyond that. And so they do have a reasonable amount of weight between f16 and the automatic position. It's not as hard or definite as what I would like, but at least they've gotten rid of the notches there. So that's progress. I was able to do a reasonable aperture rack there. It's not incredibly smooth. It's not perfectly without any kind of visible steps, but not bad. At least I was able to pull it off. And so a decent amount of success there. Now, when it comes to the manual focus ring, the manual focus ring has a decent amount of damping. That feels pretty good. However, unfortunately, when you're focusing, I really did notice some obvious steps. This is, with all mirrorless lenses, the input on the manual focus ring goes through the focus motor. So it's not a direct connection, but rather it flows. The input that you do on the ring goes through the focus motors. And in this case, rather than being able to focus in a smooth, linear sweep, instead you will see little steps along the way. I don't love that, but it is what it is, and I just need to report on it. Inside, we have an 11-bladed rounded aperture, which is nice. It does maintain a circular shape decently, and it also has a decent-looking sunburst effect, or sun star when it is stopped down. There is a USB-C port on the lens mount, and so that's good. The process for firmware updates is very similar to what it was for Viltrox lenses before they had their actual app and Bluetooth, but and so it's pretty straightforward, pretty easy to do. Now, we don't have, which has been the case for this whole series, we don't have a weather sealing gasket, so it's not a weather sealed lens. However, obviously we do have a lens hood that is included. It doesn't click into place quite as definite as what I would like, and it also feels like a little bit of a tight fit, and so it doesn't like rotate as smoothly as what I would like. However, it's there, it's included, it looks good with the lens design. Minimum focus distance here is 32 centimeters, which is not great at all. And so that gives you a very low maximum magnification. I estimated about 0.09 times. The Samyang, for example, allows you to focus as closely as 19 centimeters and gives you a much, much higher level of magnification. So if you're thinking about doing up close shots with a 24mm lens, this is not your guy. Overall, it is a nicely executed package in many ways. However, some of the fine details I don't feel are as well executed here as what I saw in the 85mm. I felt like the 85mm lens was progress from the 50mm. This almost feels like not a full step back, but maybe a half step back in the execution of some of the fine details, like the manual focus ring and seeing those visible steps. How about autofocus? Autofocus comes via an STM focus motor. As far as the focus speed is not bad. It's relatively quiet in operation. No major concern on that front. Typical focus changes are nice and quick. I didn't think about it much in real-world use, so no problem there. Furthermore, accuracy, at least when it comes to one shot or single shot, is excellent. However, there has been an ongoing problem with this series that continues to be the case, unfortunately, and that is that if there is any kind of movement, I just tracked my robo lawnmower moving towards me. It's not moving fast. It's not a difficult subject. However, you can see from the burst that focus results are all over the place. So out of a 19-shot burst, I believe that there were 6 that were accurately focused during that time. So front and back focusing. So anytime you have action, it doesn't do the trick. So I don't know if that's a focus algorithm problem or if it's just not enough thrust in the focus motors. I suspect it's really the former because autofocus doesn't feel slow, but it's just not confident at all with any kind of moving subject. So that's something you're going to need to be aware of. On the video side of things, video AF results are mostly good. Focus changes are fairly confident. You know, a little bit of a micro pulsing or settling periodically, but not bad there. My hand test and the transition from my hand to my eye, it went fairly well, as you can see. Overall focus transitions, they felt fine, I would say. I did see, for example, in this clip where I was at the marina in Pembroke and I was shooting, back and forth, that, focus sometimes give me a little bit of a back rack. And so, but overall, not too bad in general. So when it comes to the image quality side of things, I'll give you a quick overview, and then if you want the deep dive into the optics, that will come at the end of the video. We have an optical design of 14 elements in 11 groups. That includes, as you can see from this diagram, extra low dispersion, high refractive index elements, aspherical lenses. So about half of the elements here are exotics, which is, impressive for an inexpensive lens. It has a mostly strong optical performance even at f1.8. And you can see here that you're perfectly capable of shooting wide open and even on a high resolution 61 megapixel body, being able to deeply crop and still have nice resolution results. I found that the distortion pattern there's a low amount of distortion, but it's a very complex distortion. And so that means that you can't really connect, for example, there's what looks like pincushion distortion in the corners. If you try to correct for that, you create barrel distortion in the middle of the frame. So a very minor amount of correction, a -1, was about as good as I could get it manually. And so that leaves, probably, let's say 4/5 of the frame that looks good, with just the corners being affected with that distortion. And that's about as good as I can do. Right now, there isn't a correction profile, and 7Artisan lenses, at least on Sony, don't always get good profile support. So hopefully that will change in the future, but that's the situation on the ground at the moment. Vignette isn't bad, particularly for a fast wide-angle lens. It's 40. I used a +44 to correct. That's less than 2 stops, no major issue there. Likewise, there is some minimal longitudinal chromatic aberrations, a little bit of fringing before and after the plane of focus, but remember, it's a wide-angle lens and it doesn't have a particularly close focus distance, so there's not going to be a lot of situations where you're going to have a shallow depth of field where you're going to see that anyway. I don't think it's much of a real-world problem. As you can see from this shot of my old SLR, not a lot of fringing showing up there. I did see some minor lateral chromatic aberrations. They definitely showed up on my test chart. However, I didn't really see them as much out in real-world shots. And so I don't think it's going to be much of a real-world issue, at least that I can tell. In terms of resolution, and again, the crops are showing at 200% magnification on a 61 megapixel Sony a7R5. And so at f1.8, I found that the center sharpness is very good. I found that the mid-frame was sharp but lower contrast, and then the corners were a bit softer. Then at f2, there is not much of an improvement, but a more obvious improvement by f2.8, and that is impacting not only the center, but now the corners and the mid-frame are starting to improve. Actually found that from f2.8 to f8, there wasn't really much of a difference. So the good news is that if you stop down to f2.8, and even if you're shooting in dimmer lighting conditions, as long as you don't need the depth of field, you're going to get pretty close to maximum sharpness out of the lens, which is useful. I found that sharpness was pretty consistent from f8 to f11, just a little bit of softening due to diffraction and a little bit more obvious diffraction showing up at f16. Now, when it comes to the bokeh quality, again, wide-angle lens, so you're not going to get as much defocused background. I did find if there were specular highlights in the frame, bokeh balls, they're a little bit busy, but outside of that, what I found is that the overall quality of the blur really looks pretty decent. And again, you're not going to get a lot of strongly defocused background, but what I did see seems to be handled fairly nicely. So I don't really have any real reservations there. When it comes to flare resistance, there is very little veiling. It holds contrast really well, which is important in a wide-angle lens. However, you will see somewhat of a ghosting pattern, like a flare pattern. It's not terribly destructive. I don't think it's a deal breaker on this lens, so overall, flare not too bad. So my conclusion is this: the build quality and the optical performance are mostly that of a more expensive lens. In some ways, it's a lens that punches above its weight. I would say when it comes to autofocus, that autofocus is fine if you're shooting single shot, but if you're wanting action or you're wanting the flexibility of potentially doing action, 7Artisans isn't quite there yet. There are a number of other lens makers that are better than them in this regard. I would say that the Samyang AF 24mm F1.8, while being $100 more expensive, is probably still my favorite lens here on Sony, at least, because it is so much smaller and lighter, has better autofocus. It also does have weather sealing. And so it has a few things that are missing on this. It's not as nicely built as the 7Artisans lens, but where the rubber meets the road, I feel like it has enough to me to be worth that extra $100, but your mileage may vary, obviously, on that. That could be a factor overall. However, the Samyang lens is not going to be available on either Nikon Z or L mount. And so it really only is a factor, as I'm describing here, on Sony. Now, if you want more information, you can dive into either my text review, which is linked in the description down below. There is an image gallery link there, along with some buying links if you want to purchase one. And now, if you would like to take a little bit of a deeper look at the image quality and the optical performance, jump in with me right now, and let's see what happens. All right, first of all, we'll take a look at vignette and distortion. You can see, now taking a little bit closer look, the complexity of this distortion pattern that I described before. So what you can see is on the edges of the frame, we've got some pincushion distortion. However, that pincushion distortion is not consistently there. So you can see here that if I move to kind of take the bend out of the corners here, it would just kind of pucker out the center and causing a barrel distortion there. So it's what we call a mustache pattern, where it's not a linear distortion in one direction or the other. So over here, I've done a very mild -1, but you can see even with that -1, it's a little bit more bulged out in the middle than it was here. However, it does correct just a little bit of the extremes on the cornel. Your best kind of case scenario is that if you're really in a really critical situation, step back a little bit further, and if you crop to like this zone, it's flawless. It's just really out on the edge that you have a problem. Vignette is really quite minor. I mean, it's a +43 to correct. That's really not much for f1.8 on a wide-angle lens, so that's not a problem at all. Now you can see here there is some longitudinal style chromatic aberrations, mostly in the form of this green fringing after the plane of focus. But again, there's not a lot of situations where you're going to get close enough and have such a shallow depth of field that that's going to be like an actual problem. And so in this case here, yeah, you can see in a few spots there's some very minor fringing, but it's, you know, you're not going to see that at all at this distance, which is the way that just about everybody's viewing it. I also don't really see a whole lot of distracting fringing around any specular highlights. However, you can see that those specular highlights really look like, I don't know, some planetary bodies. There's a lot going on there, and so they're not really all that clean looking. Now, lateral style chromatic aberrations definitely show up on my test chart. You can see a lot of that false color on either side of the black and white transitions. However, in a real-world shot, I went to this thinking, okay, I'm definitely going to see it. And yes, I mean, you can see a little bit there, but I'm having to really look hard for it, and I'm not seeing a lot. And this should be a great situation, particularly with this, you know, bright white of the poplar there. It should be a great transition zone for that, and I'm not really seeing it, so I'm not overly concerned. All right, taking a look at resolution, again, 61 megapixels. We're going to look at 200% magnification. Center of the frame looks good. Good detail, good contrast, no concerns there. As we move towards the mid frame, again, the detail is good. Resolution is fine. Contrast, you can see, is a little bit on the low side. If we pop on down here, you know, this actually is quite consistent in this zone, no problem there. And as we move down towards the corner, you can just see that, particularly as we get off towards this edge of the frame, the resolution is just, there's actually still some decent contrast there, but the detail is not all that good. So it's kind of an inversion of what we saw in the mid frame. Taking a quick look around, we can see we get roughly the same result on the left side, upper left, looking good. Upper right also looking good. I will say I think maybe the left side is a little bit better than what the right side is, but it's not by any big margin at all. Now, taking that into a real-world shot at 100%, this is f1.8. You can see that here in the center of the frame, resolution looks fine. Contrast, again, is not like off the charts good, but, no real problem there. Depth of field is going to affect a real-world image. You can see a little bit of that lateral-style chromatic aberration in this shot, but I would say it certainly has usable resolution all across the frame. In a better situation, better lighting here, I feel like this image pops a bit more. And so in the center of the frame, definitely more detail and contrast. And again, depth of field is not going to allow us to really examine the corners here, but the image itself is holding up by and large. Now from f1.8 to f2, we can see a very minor contrast gain. It is noticeable, but it's not significant. However, from f2 to f2.8, that becomes much more pronounced. And you can see here looking at this text just how much higher the contrast is here relative to what it is at f2. Moving to the mid frame, you can see a similar truth here that this looks still kind of washed out while this is becoming nice and high contrast. If we look up here into the upper left corner, you can see that it's looking really, really good right up into the corner. Only in that last little bit is that resolution falling off. If we take a look down here at this corner, you can see it's actually a little shakier here in general. Contrast is definitely better and detail is improving. By f5.6, it's looking really quite good everywhere save maybe that last little bit. However, in this on the side that it's a little bit stronger, it's looking quite good up here into the corner. Again, just that last little bit is not quite as good. At f11, you'll see a little bit of softening due to diffraction. At f16, which is the minimum aperture, it's much more obvious. And so avoid f16 unless you absolutely need to go there. So obviously our magnification level is very low. And even though you're not very close to the subject, it still doesn't have a particularly flat plane of focus either. And so you can see a pretty narrow area of focus, and then it really softens up past that zone. So unfortunately, just not very flat as far as the plane of focus. So what that means is that up close, you're never going to get super high resolution. And I also feel like the contrast isn't amazing up close. However, the background blur is really not bad. I think that this is actually relatively soft for a wide-angle lens. Again, here you can see the background is not strongly defocused, but it is nicely defocused. There's no kind of distracting lines. It's not harsh at all. Bokeh quality is really quite good. And this image, this obviously I'd like to be able to get closer than this and to get a more strong background blur, but the quality of the bokeh, I would say, is strong. I didn't like it with specular highlights, but I like it with other things. Now, as far as the color rendition, colors are good, not great. It's kind of like earlier Viltrox lenses where the optical glass, again, the colors don't look bad, but there's something about it that feels just a little bit cheaper to my eye, having reviewed hundreds and hundreds of lenses. And I can tell high-end optical glass from cheaper optical glass, and this feels cheaper. But again, it's not bad. You're going to be able to get nice-looking images from it. Flare resistance, again, is not bad at all. Here at a larger maximum aperture, you can see there's a bit of a ghosting pattern, but as we saw with the panning back and forth, it's not destructive. Here's a little bit closer look at that 22-bladed Sunstar. And again, this is at f11, by the way. So you can see that the ghosting patterns is a little bit more pronounced, but it's not terrible, and I'm not even trying to avoid it here at this point. I'm trying to maximize it. So I think you can pose in a way that it's a more flattering. So just watch out for that. And other than that, not too bad here with the optical performance. So thanks for watching until the end. I hope that the optical deep dive has helped you to get a better sense as to whether or not this inexpensive 7Artisans lens is the next one for your own kit. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.